G'day everyone, just some quick insights into today's podcast. I have to say, this has been actually one of the most fun conversations I've had in the last 12 months. All of them have been excellent, but this one really just sort of leveled up for me. I don't know why, I'm really passionate about the humanity that exists inside organizations. When you're a founder and you've got, I don't know, 5 to 50 people, and you're always thinking about, you spend, 90% of your time thinking about how to create the right environment for people to thrive and to be able to do their best work and to bring their full selves. And it's really important to me that humanity shows up. And so when it comes to things like feedback, you might think, I don't need to learn anything about feedback. I'm like the master of feedback. Well, I think you can guarantee that you are going to learn some stuff about how you show up in conversations where you need to give someone some guidance and how you think about receiving that guidance or asking for that guidance in return. How do you build, those are the interactions that build trust in your organization and build loyalty to you and to the team and each other and how they build safety together. So I think there's a huge amount to learn in this episode. Please listen all the way through to the end. You're going to hear Amy's going to give you some downloadable tools at the end that are going to help you understand radical candor, the practices, the specificity in the tools and how you can use them. You're going to love today's episode. Get amongst it. Have a great time. Speak to you soon.
Welcome to the Scale Ups podcast, where each week you get to hear Sean Steele, professional CEO, growth mentor, and advisory board chair, unpack the strategies that successful founders have used to achieve scale in their businesses. Stay tuned as he interviews the entrepreneurs who've made it, learns from industry experts, and follows a group of founders still striving to scale.
G'day everyone, and welcome to the Scale Ups podcast, where we help first-time founders learn the secrets of scaling so they can fulfill the potential of their businesses, make bigger decisions with greater confidence, and maximize the impact they can have in the world. I am your host, Sean Steele, and I have a very special guest with us today, Amy Sandler, Chief Content Officer at Radical Candor and host of the Radical Candor podcast. How are you today, Amy?
I'm doing great. It's fun to be with you today, Sean. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I know I'm very excited about this conversation. Many of our audience will have heard the name of the book, Radical Candor, published in 2017 by Kim Scott, former Apple and Google exec. And I guess the premise of the book is, how to be a kick-ass boss without losing your humanity by finding the right ways to give and receive feedback. And this book's gone gangbusters in the last 5 years. How many copies have been printed now, and in how many languages is
I should have that answer off the top of my tongue, but I
it?
do not have it. I will say though that it has been a New York, at least in the U.S., New York Times bestseller, and
Mhm.
I think in terms of the solidity of the ideas, the company where I'm the chief content officer is the executive education company based on the book that Kim wrote, and we're busier than ever. So the ideas are
Mm,
really relevant and have found an audience. There's also, by the way, a lot in the book beyond feedback, really,
mm.
how to do meetings successfully and how to build and grow your team. So there's a lot to it. We tend to focus a lot on feedback because that's a real challenge for most folks, but a lot of other great content in that book.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Because, giving and receiving feedback, when you're a founder of a business, you've got, a lot of our audience are, first time founders running services businesses, $2 to $20 million in revenue, often in very sort of traditional arenas like, recruitment, accounting, education, IT services, things like that. They're experts in their industry. They've got, strong desire, they hustle, they've got great work ethic, they've got adaptability and they get these businesses moving. But many of them don't have a great or clear framework for delivering feedback. And whilst it seems like something that we should all just somehow innately know how to be good at, I think about the number of difficult conversations I've entered in my earlier career where I've kind of just about to get into it. You're like 15 minutes, 30 minutes before, and you're like, I'm not even sure how I should start this. Like, I don't even have a framework to think through to make sure that I actually nail even the opening, you know, 5 to 20 seconds, which is going to set the whole tone for this entire meeting. Like, how do I do that? It's not something that you just, innately know from my perspective. And I was super fortunate in my last company. I was leading a portfolio of companies, and we had really high engagement scores. But I credit the vast majority of that to our people and performance director, Nicola, who had a very core leadership principle about addressing things the moment they occurred. And
Hmm.
I don't know why, but I mean, I've been in a lot of companies before that, but no one had ever really called that out as like a really important leadership principle when it came to, I guess, identifying opportunities to provide feedback was how quickly that needed to be done. And I found it took a lot of courage for myself and for other leaders. People had to really rise to it because they weren't used to that being part of their environment, you know. And every time I looked around and I saw issues, when you trace those issues back, you 9 times out of 10, it was a leader who was seeing something happen where feedback was required, but they were nervous or procrastinating. And like, how important is in the context of getting these conversations right? How important is the speed as just one? Obviously, it's one ingredient, but how important is that? Do you think?
Yeah, speed is definitely important. We talk about radically candid feedback, and by the way, just to be clear, feedback is just as much, if not more, praise as it is
Mm,
criticism.
yeah.
Another thing we like to say is actually framing it more as guidance. In other words, sometimes feedback can sound very, I know better than you. You have to do it this way. We're
Mm,
really talking about, sharing our perspective in a way that's helpful, and being immediate is really important if you're doing something well, just as much as if it's not going well. I was leading a workshop, and someone shared a story where they were out of their home country after giving 10 business development presentations. They were flying home with their boss. Their boss says to them, that phrase you used in that culture is really inappropriate. You should have used a different phrase. Well, they already just did 10 presentations with using that inappropriate phrase, and so that's where, we like to say feedback has a short half-life, and so the timing is important. You also talked about something that I think is really important, and something that we feel really strongly about at Radical Candor, which is that, there's a lot of great feedback models out there. But when you talk about the courage to say it or the courage to do it
mm,
immediately, what your Nicola that you mentioned was doing, we're really focused not just on sort of the model, and we do have a model that we use, but also to really get to the root cause of the
mm,
issue, which is about really addressing the underlying relationship. What is the context between these two people? We really see this as between, first of all, practicing radical candor is back and forth with two people, a one on one conversation. And then
mhm,
from there, if I may use the word scaling that, those conversations to create the culture. But it really is starting with these one on one relationships, and how can we build the kinds of relationships so that we have the courage and we both give it and receive it in a way that is really to be helpful, for folks. And so I think getting
mm.
in underneath the model into what gets in the way of us saying these seemingly difficult things.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've got so many questions about that. Maybe before I start jumping in and taking us down lots of rabbit holes, maybe you could give the audience who doesn't know, hasn't read the book, or isn't aware of the model, just talk us a little bit about the framework that you use that helps, I guess, sort of put maybe a box or put some context around how radical
Sure,
candor thinks about this.
sure, absolutely. I mean, it's a really simple idea. It's not always so simple to put it into practice, but it's this idea that you can build really great relationships at work, and the way that you can build these relationships that are focused on collaboration, on teamwork, is showing that you actually care about the person that you work with. You're respecting their humanity, at the same time you're willing to challenge them directly. And we were talking at the beginning about this kind of 2 by 2 matrix that Kim Scott developed. She and I went to business school together, and we joke that one of the things you learn at business school is, if you ever have a problem, just throw it on a 2 by 2 matrix. So if
It's
you
got
can
to have,
imagine, just
yeah,
anything
everything
that
needs a
seems at
matrix. Yeah.
odds, just throw it into a 2 by 2 matrix. So if you have on one dimension, the care personally axis, and on the other, the challenge directly, the sort of horizontal and the vertical, and you think, well, gosh, I can't care and challenge at the same time. And it's like, no, in fact you can. That's what makes it radical. Kim is really intentional about words. So one word is the word candor, and mindful that we speak different flavors maybe of the English language, but
Mhm,
candor is a different word than truth. And it was very intentional to choose the word candor, because candor, this is really about, I am sharing my perspective. This is how I see it. How do you see it? Rather
mhm.
than I'm the only one who sort of has their hands
You've got the
on the
reality. Yeah.
truth. And so, yeah, so candor is really
Mm,
about sharing our perspective. And what makes it radical is that it's so rare.
mm,
Usually we're making mistakes where either we're caring about the person and we're not challenging them. We call that ruinous empathy. or we're challenging them. The challenge is super clear, but we're acting like a jerk because we're forgetting that there's a human there and we're yelling at them in the middle of a meeting.
Mm,
Or sometimes we just don't do either of those things and we neither care nor challenge. And I can kind of double click into those different
mm,
quadrants, but I think it's really the reason why I think this framework is so helpful is that you can really start to use it as a compass to kind of guide conversations on the spot with the folks
mm,
that you work with. You're like, oh, gosh, I really was being really challenging there. Maybe I need to move up on care. Maybe I wasn't being clear enough.
mhm.
I think a lot of this is about clarity. I like to reframe sometimes the challenge directly as the clarity. Can I get more and more clear in what I'm saying? So
I
radically
love
candid conversations are kind and clear.
mm, that's so true, and I think about so there's 2 words that really jumped out to me in what you were saying there. The first one was truth, I think about and I'm sure you've heard many people come to, workshops or engagements maybe that your team has done, where they say, "I just tell it how it is." Like, "That's who I am. I'm just like a straight shooter. I just give it how it is," and I'm like, "That's like, I get that." That doesn't mean that what you are intending is the way it's going to be received, and actually, you kinda need to care about that, and so what I love is this balance between care, which is not about a fluffy, that's not about being fluffy, and challenging directly so that you're getting clarity and you're not withholding, I guess, information because you're sort of scared of how someone responds, but you're finding this balance where there's humanity inside it, and actually, it's not I always think, in the absence of that feedback, that's what's inhumane. So if somebody's behaving in a certain way and they may have no awareness of it whatsoever, it could be completely in their blind spot. And in the absence of you giving them that feedback and bringing that thing up to the light and letting you both have a look at it together in a collaborative way, in the absence of that feedback, they go back to doing it. Nobody else is helping. No one else is telling them. That's actually inhumane. The humanity is having the conversation, not running away from it.
Absolutely. If it's helpful, I can share a story when,
Yeah,
I
great.
received some radical candor. We're big believers in stories as a way to kind of showcase what you're talking about. And I think also when we talk about care personally, challenge directly, it's going to depend on each person. Care personally is going to look different from you than it does for me, et cetera. And so I was this was a time in my career when I was on what we would call a really steep growth trajectory. It was kind of all about me. It was all about my success. I just moved from being an individual contributor to a manager and had a meeting where we had just launched this website. And my boss, who was the chief marketing officer, asked me afterwards how the meeting went. It was with the CEO and the CFO. And I said the meeting was great. The CEO was really happy with what the board was saying, and the CFO was thrilled with the numbers. And I'd gotten this new brand project. My background was in marketing and communications, and so I said the meeting was amazing. Like I thought it was a home run, if I may use an American
Hmm. Mm, there
phrase
we go.
there.
Yeah.
I'd love to learn the international
Yeah,
version
you
of
hit it for
that.
six.
I hit her for six. All right.
Yeah.
I hope I said that right.
Yeah.
So, I was really just I was thrilled, and Steve was really, complimentary and congratulated me. He knew how hard we'd worked, and then he asked, what did I think Brooke and Jenny thought of the meeting? And I said, they thought the meeting was great. Brooke was doing the analytics and Jenny was doing the content. And Steve nodded very patiently, and he shared, you know, did you notice that when the CFO asked Brooke about the numbers, they're right in front of him, you interrupted Brooke? And I got really annoyed and I said, well, Brooke didn't seem to know how to answer the questions, and then I did the same thing. He sort of pointed out I'd done the same thing with Jenny, and I didn't even let her answer. And it was this moment when these things happened where I went, and I'm very sensitive. I like to call myself a recovering perfectionist. So when he pointed these things out, I went from being like, how can you say this? I was doing great in the meeting, to all of a sudden, oh my God, this is a disaster. And I was
Mm,
so embarrassed. And then he said, did you notice what happened to Brooke and Jenny during the last 10 minutes of the meeting? And it was just like this, it was so upsetting because I realized in that moment I'd not looked at them once.
mm,
And I was so focused on, the most important people in the room, the,
mm.
the CEO and the CFO, that I wasn't even paying attention to my team. And he said, because Brooke looked like he was about to blow a gasket. Jenny was miserable, wanted to be anywhere but there. And I'm afraid you're going to lose your team. And he was right. They were all furious with me. And it was just to your point about that not having humanity. It would have been so much easier for Steve not to share the feedback. And by the way,
Yeah.
he said something that was really powerful, which is that, Amy, I know how much you care. I love how competitive you are. And I know you can be a great manager, but a great manager lets their people shine. And, when I think back on those moments, it would have been so much easier for Steve not to tell me.
Mm,
Right? It took real courage, right?
mm,
Because he knows how sensitive I am. He knows I think it's a great meeting. And by the way, the other thing I realized was that it didn't make him look very good in front of his, peers, the CEO
mhm,
and the CFO. It could have been very easy for him to be like frustrated and pissed off with me and interrupting to try to save it for himself. But he didn't do that. He was really focused on how can I help. And so
mm,
that really came across in that moment, and there were some things that he had done as well to show he was really invested in my own success.
mm,
A very heavy door fell on me when I was traveling. He was on the phone with me all night. He invested in this mindfulness program when my company didn't want to invest in it, that I'd been accepted into, before this was a thing. And so it was those kinds of things. I like to call them like deposits in the relationship bank.
mm.
I knew he was invested in my success. And so when he was giving me that feedback, even though as a quote recovering perfectionist who wasn't in the recovery stage at that point, it felt like a ton of bricks had just fallen on me.
Oh, yeah.
Didn't feel great, but it my gosh, what a gift. Because again, it would
Yeah.
have the easier thing would have been for him not to say it, which is what we would call ruinous empathy, where you're so worried about the other person, you don't want to hurt their feelings, that you don't tell them what they need to know.
Let it slide. Wow, and I love that he
Yeah.
started with a real recognition of the positive intention that you had rather than just starting with the things that went wrong, which is such an important place because everyone's got a positive intention for the behavior that they're displaying, whether they're aware of what the behavior is creating around them or not. It's usually always coming from a great place because they want something positive. They want some kind of positive outcome, even if it looks to us to be a bad, brackets a bad behavior. I remember it's so interesting you telling that story. It really brought up for me in my first executive role. I was head of sales and marketing for quite a large company. We had, I don't know, 1,500 people in Australia and 3,500 worldwide. I was leading sales and marketing, business development, and I'd always I'd always been a very kind of A type, go for goals, big ambition, and so on and so on.
Hmm.
And that sort of got me quite a long way. It wasn't that I was completely cutthroat or brutal, but I was very focused and very ambitious. Anyway, I got to this role, been in it for maybe a year and a half, and got this great opportunity to have some sort of executive leadership coaching for our executive team. And the starting point with this was 360. And they said, okay, you need to get all of your team to give you feedback. You need to get two peers and your one-up manager. And I was like, cool, I'd never been through this before. And so, yep, no problems. Happy to get it all from my team. Got it from my boss. And I was like, oh, which peers am I going to choose? And I thought, if I choose, peers, of course, are the ones who are most likely to give you probably the most direct feedback because they've got sort of nothing to lose, right? They don't work for you, they don't manage you, and I remember thinking about it, going, I really need to get feedback from the operations director because really, out of everybody in this company, I run the front end. She does all the delivery. Like she's got the biggest team and so on. And we just could not see eye to eye. Like there was just something in our relationship. We had almost zero rapport. Like I felt like she didn't trust me from day one. Like I was kind of on the back foot. Anyway, I got this feedback, and what was really clear was she was like, essentially, Sean has one way, it's his way. If he thinks there's some feedback coming that he doesn't want to hear, he just goes around you. Like he essentially will just cut you
Mm.
out to try to get to his goal. That is his model of the world. And I was like, holy cow. And I remember my coach saying, have you considered how career limiting this behavior is? I mean, like you're the golden boy. Everyone thinks you're great. You're kind of, probably the next in line for the CEO and all the rest. But do you think your peers, if you were to move to CEO, do you think your peers are going to support you into that role? Like, forget the CEO. He might think you're great and your team might think you're great. But what about your peers? And I was like, oh, it was so I was like, wow, I am really being an ass. And it was so true. And it was the way. And I was scared of getting feedback that I didn't want to hear and not maybe knowing how to deal with it or interrupting my plans and me having to change something that I didn't want to do. And but the quality of that feedback was so good. And I remember sitting down with her afterwards and unpacking with her how much I got from her perspective because it was so valuable to me for my personal development. And again, she could have very easily gone, Sean's not even going to listen to this. I'm just not going to. I'm just going to say, yep, yep, all good, all good, all good. which would have been, I guess, a good example of your sort of ruinous empathy. No, like just let him go.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that story. Again, we're such big believers in the power of these stories, and this stuff happens all the time. And I think, what's underneath it, why she wouldn't tell you this, sort of directly, or, if you're afraid, like it took the courage, and you had the courage to hear it and to act on it. And I think, it's so important when we think about building this culture of radical candor. We start out by talking about getting feedback before we go before we move into giving each other criticism. We have to start by getting it, especially if we're the
Hmm.
leader. We've got to lay the power down, show that we're able to take it. If you know the phrase, sort of take it before we start dishing it out, but also giving praise, saying what's working well, so that,
Hmm.
you're really acknowledging what is going well. And I think, just to also highlight processes, one thing we hear so often in organizations is how people are kind of blindsided by, I got something in a performance review and no one had told me this all year that this was a problem. And
Mm.
so what we really want to build are these frequent one-on-one conversations where we're talking about what's working well, what can be improved, and we're starting by talking about getting that feedback. So in an ideal world, by the time you get to the 360, you've had all of these conversations, and
No
so there's
surprises.
there's no surprises, and it can
Yeah,
really be more forward looking. And we hear this,
that's so true.
people come to us like over and over because, employees feel like they're not getting the kind of feedback they need to grow. They don't feel like they're being developed, or they're not
Hmm.
feeling connected to their manager. And, people are getting surprised in reviews, or when you were talking about sort of, large turnover, exit interviews, survey data, when you talked about engagement, survey data.
Hmm.
And when you dig in, why is this happening? It's because managers and peers and other, people don't feel comfortable or skillful enough to have these kinds of conversations. And whether
Mm.
it's, we'll ask people, we'll do a poll, what is it about giving criticism like that's the hardest, and what's the hardest part about receiving? And it's everything from, I don't want to hurt the person's feelings, to retaliation, to, is it really worth it, or is it, am I seeing it right, to, I don't trust the person, I'm going to be embarrassed. So there's a lot under
Mhm.
the surface. If this wasn't happening, we wouldn't be busier than ever. And, because there's the real sort of emotional part of it, like, I don't want to have to change, and I don't want to know that I'm not perfect, and I just want to
Mm.
keep going in the direction. And so we have to do some real, like, we have to be willing to look in the mirror and see where
Mm.
we're making the kinds of mistakes, whether it's like the ruinous empathy that we're talking about, or the obnoxious aggression where the challenge is really clear, but you're not seeing the other person
There's no care.
as,
Mm.
as a part, which maybe was the dynamic that you were having with this operations person of,
Mhm.
just sort of, it's my way or the highway, and I'm just going
Mm.
to,
Bulldoze.
blow in, and we do exactly bulldoze.
Yeah.
And then often what happens after we've acted, and by the way, we all act like jerks, so originally, if I can use an off color word, uh, Kim was going to call the obnoxious aggression quadrant the asshole quadrant, because it seemed, more more
Yeah, more
radically
direct.
candid. Like, it's pretty direct.
Yeah.
But the reason she didn't was, first of all, it's not a very nice word. But number two, we all act like jerks. And so I think it's really important to use these kind of quadrants or these mistakes. These are mistakes we all make in conversation.
Mm.
We can do it in one conversation where you're sort of acting like a jerk, and then you backpedal, and then you don't say anything.
But
And so I think just to not,
it's also taking the behavior and turning it into the person, like saying, "Okay, well, just because 'cause I've seen some
ex-
obnoxiously aggressive behavior, that doesn't mean the person's an asshole all the time." As we, as you said, we all step in and out of those moments. That doesn't mean that we're a bad person because we have some bad behaviors every now and again.
Absolutely. And that's something that we as humans like to do a lot. We start to sort of put people into boxes, and
Mm.
that's part of how we end up dehumanizing each other, like, oh, they're such a jerk, or oh, they'll never listen. And so part of our model is really about being specific about the actual behavior or work product. So I'm not saying, oh, Sean, you're a genius, or oh, Sean, you're an
Mm.
idiot. It was,
Generalizing.
in
Mm.
this specific meeting, you weren't able to answer the question, or you answered the question succinctly, and as a result this, and, as a next step that. So we have a model for that, and it really takes it out of that, what we like to say, it's not about personality. The
Mm.
model is very much about things you can change, either behavior or work performance, and that's where being really specific and thinking about, why does this matter to this person? Does it matter because now you're going to get the funding request or you're going to get the promotion? Like, do you know this person well enough to kind of align your feedback in a way that's helpful for them that with their
Mm.
motivation?
Jesus, so much in there. Let me take one step back. One thing I'd love to
Yeah,
say is because I am a huge believer, and we built this into the culture of every subsidiary that we had was we built a rhythm of one-on-ones that was always monthly, and in every one of those monthly one-on-ones, you were looking at performance, and you were also looking at the professional development. So it was a holistic sort of performance portfolio, if you like what you're trying to achieve, what's been going on, and so on. And we said there should never be a performance appraisal. There's no surprises. There should be zero surprises because you're having a
hmm
quality conversation that's two-way in feedback every month. Like, how am I going? How am I going in supporting you? What do you need from me? What aren't you getting from me? What's not working for you? That's part of the conversation. And therefore, in, half an hour every month, you have completely obliterated the need for quarterly or 6 monthly or annual performance appraisals, which scare the life out of people. I feel it's such an inhumane practice to rock up at the end of the year and like find out how you're going, like, and then get some feedback that should have been given to you 8 months ago. It's like, wow, that is so unhelpful. So I think that, back to the principle around Nicola, the reason we built such a strong culture was people knew that if there was something, people began to trust the leaders that if there was a behavior that was not in line with the values of the organization, leaders would act on it immediately. There would be a conversation. It wouldn't slide by, it wouldn't kind of be left to fester. Because that's where you really start to damage your culture. You've got all these people who are going, oh, actually, maybe those kinds of things are like they start to sort of pull back because they're not quite sure what to expect. If you don't jump on those things, and I don't mean jump on it in an obnoxious and aggressive way, but
right.
I address it immediately, have a quality conversation. And I love the way that you describe the specificity and the behavior. And I'd love to chat to you a bit more just about the setup and the ingredients of the quality
Sure.
conversation. But I always used to talk about it like that's probably not a great analogy, but it always made sense to me. It's like putting the scorpion on the table. So it's like if we're both sitting in a room and there's something going on, there's a scorpion running around on the floor. Like there's some behavior going on. Neither of us are talking about it. It's like somebody just pick the friggin' scorpion up, stick it in the middle of the table,
Yeah.
and go, look, we've got a scorpion in the room. That's really interesting. Let's have a look. Let's hold it up to the light. Let's have a look at it
Yeah.
together and analyze it together. So we're kind of this equity in power base in the conversation that we're just exploring it. I don't know what it means. I don't know why the scorpion's in the room, but maybe you know why the scorpion's in the room. Did you bring the scorpion into the room? I don't know. Like, what do you think about this
I
scorpion? Like,
Yeah, that is so great. And I really appreciate what you're talking about, the one-on-ones, which is, for us, all of these conversations are happening in regular, frequent, I would say even more than monthly, in an
yes,
ideal world, more like weekly, because
yeah,
we want this to become more like brushing and flossing rather than a root canal. So that
mm,
and also that it's all developmental. So you're talking about this is about your growth. So if I am giving you feedback or guidance, this is in service of my growth, not about, oh,
mm,
Amy's signing my paycheck this month. So when you think about
mm-hmm,
building trust, that it is coming from this place of this is to help you
yeah,
develop. And that the performance feedback is really in service of your growth, and to kind of like you were saying, decoupling the actual review from this ongoing developmental conversations
mm,
that are frequent. They're talking about, for me, if I'm your boss, about, what am I doing? That's did I bring the does it feel like there's a scorpion in the room every time we're
mm-hmm,
together? What's one
mm,
thing I could do to get us out of this dynamic where we're not talking about the scorpion? How can I be a better
yeah.
communication partner? So starting with what we would call go-to questions. But the other thing that you can do is,
And what are those? So
as a
what would be some of
leader,
those go-to questions?
so go-to questions, yeah, to solicit feedback from the people that you work with. And a good go-to question, first of all, it's not a yes or no question. So it's not, hey Sean, do you have any feedback for me? And you're like, oh no, Amy, you're still perfect. And
Am
like,
I
oh
doing a
good,
great job?
okay,
Yes.
I
Tick. Okay. Thank
yeah,
you. Okay.
yeah, of
That's all I
course you're
need.
doing a great tick, tick, tick. Okay, great. I can go on with my day.
Yeah.
So, not a yes or no question. It's clear, like what kind of feedback I'm looking for. It's in my voice, and it's in a voice that would work for you. So, for example, Kim and Jason are the co-founders of Radical Candor, and Kim had this go-to question, what's one thing I could start or stop doing that would make it easier for us to work together? So that was a question she would frequently ask
That's nice.
people. Well,
Yeah.
Jason hates that question for whatever. That's not a question he welcomes. So they do a different question. So
Yeah.
finding questions that work. So one sort of line of questioning that I love is, we tend to work with people the way that we like to work. So I tend to be a
Mm,
little bit of a micromanager. So a question for me to ask is, what's one thing that you wish I had not gotten involved with, you this week, or where's something you wish I hadn't been too involved with, like you didn't need
mm,
me involved in it.
yeah.
And then a similar question. Jason has a different style. He likes to work on his own, and got feedback at a previous company. He gave someone on his team a huge project, and she was overwhelmed. So a really good question for him is, where's something where you actually needed support from me,
And you didn't get it.
this past week, or looking forward. So
Mm,
kinds of questions that will facilitate someone giving you, especially if you're a boss, some criticism.
yeah.
What's one thing I could do to help you feel more supported, or to help you on this project? So the words, you can tweak the words, because words that will work for you might be different from someone else. But
Mhm.
it's that idea of asking questions to get actionable feedback,
Mm,
and you can also ask a question based on behavior that you tend to do. I could say, I know I tend to talk a lot in meetings. It's really important for me to make sure that everyone in the meeting has a voice. So, can you, at our next staff meeting, can you check on sort of where I am with airtime? And I'm going to check in with you after the meeting to see what went well and what I could have done better. So, you're kind of
that's
giving
awesome.
that person permission to
Yeah.
share criticism with you. And again, it doesn't have to be like a huge thing. It's just like,
Mm,
Amy, you ended up
here's something I'm
like,
working on.
when
Yeah.
yeah, and help. It's a little, if you remembered the movie Jerry Maguire, Help Me Help You,
Yeah.
right? Like, I want to get better at
It
this.
is.
So
Yeah, and nothing builds. It's very easy to fall into the trap of um, feeling like you have to be great and like a hero and stuff all the time as a leader. Like, and I remember falling into that trap and thinking, getting to this point where I actually, because I'm super curious, so I have lots of questions. I really get to know other people, particularly in my teams. Um, But then I realized after a period of time that people didn't actually know me all that well, and it wasn't because I was holding it back in any way, but they didn't feel comfortable, and I wasn't sort of inviting them in. So I was like, "Oh yeah, I really know my team," and I'm like that. And someone said, "I'm not sure that they actually know who you are." And I was like, "Wow, okay." And to your point, when you come to them with vulnerability to go, "Hey, like I'm not perfect, and here's some stuff that I'm working on. I'd love for you to participate in my development." That is such a big trust builder, assuming that in the way that you then receive that feedback, it is, you know,
yeah, then you actually
it's
do
accepted
something about, right. I mean,
and you do
yeah,
something with it.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's huge, and that's a big reason why we're big believers in sharing your own stories when you messed up,
Mm,
sort of giving people this permission. We talk about sometimes even making a really big deal. If you're the manager, we have this thing like whoops a daisy, where you'd have, could have like a stuffed animal or something, and say, hey, I heard that I did this thing, and just kind of normalizing
mm,
this behavior, so that when we make mistakes, we feel okay, like we can call it out, we can improve, and also celebrating when things are going really well. But
yeah.
similarly with criticism, praise is not just rah rah, great job.
Mm,
It has to follow the same model that we like to use, which I can get into in a moment. But
yeah.
it has to be specific and sincere, or else it's going to miss the whole opportunity. I like to say that praise is like putting your foot on the accelerator, and criticism is putting your foot on the brake.
Mm,
And if we just, as humans, we like to focus on what's not working, but we're
mm,
not going to get very far if we just call out what's not working.
yeah.
But praise tends to fall short, because it tends to be this big, great job, but we don't know what made it great. And that's what we really want to do, is what worked well here, so that we can show what we value. We can and sort of highlight people's strengths, and we can show the team what good looks like.
So talk to me then about I guess the practicality of like how you enter these conversations. What are the ingredients that make it work? How do you get to that specificity and maybe frames that you're using? Tell me more about that.
Absolutely. So, we like to talk about this kind of order of operations of how we practice radical candor. And again, first is that go-to question. So soliciting feedback, starting to build the trust. And when you get the feedback, to what you were talking about, yes, reward the candor. If someone says, yes, you have been interrupting a lot, like, follow up with it, make the change and check
Mm,
in and see how it's going. And then we want to move on to giving praise. And so the model that we use, which has been adapted from, you might know, the Center for Creative Leadership, SBI model. We
mhm,
added this idea of a next step. And so we like to talk about, what's the context, what was the sort of observation, what are the results of what happened, and then next step. So we call it core. CORE, although technically we could call it corn and then we'd make corny jokes. But so, for example, just to give an example, a context of something could be, the quarterly budget review meeting with the CFO. Like that's all you need to say. And it's the same thing for praise and criticism. And praise could
Mhm.
be you had a complicated analysis in your deck and you answered the question succinctly. Like that's all you're focusing on work product, you're focusing on behavior. You're not saying you're a genius. Same thing
Mm.
with criticism. You're not saying you're such an idiot. You totally, screwed up the question. You're saying you weren't able to answer the CFO's follow-up question, or
Mm.
there was an error in your analysis. You're not making a judgment there. You're just,
Mm.
sort of observing it.
Yeah.
And this result part is where, especially I think with praise, but just in general, where we tend to fall short in our
Mm.
feedback. Like, why does this matter? Why does this matter to the person that we're providing this to? Why does this matter to the organization? So maybe it matters because, for praise, we're going to get the funding, or, you're on track for promotion, or the CFO knows we're the go to team. Or for criticism, it matters because now the CFO is going to double check everything we send, or, you're going to have to do a few more projects for the promotion, et cetera. So do you really know the people that you work with well enough to kind of align the feedback that you're giving in a way that is showing why this matters? and
Mm.
and the other thing that I really like about this model is that it's radical candor is not about nitpicking. It's not, you did this and you did this and you did this and you did this. It's like any good relationship, leave a few unimportant things unsaid. Like, why does this really matter? And then we added this idea of a next step, because what we found in workshops, and people would have these conversations and they think they're all agreed, and then you're
And
waiting
what's
for that email
and
that you thought you agreed to, and you're just like looking at your email inbox. I thought right, and
Yeah.
it never comes. So what is the next step? And I think what's interesting with praise, a next step could be, you know praise how also has care and challenge. It could be
Mm.
keep doing what you're doing, do the same thing for the CEO. Or it could be share with the team how you built that analysis.
Mm.
And then for criticism, it could be
Or
let's
an
meet
opportunity
next week
to,
before.
level up or stretch, the next time because it's like,
Correct. Well, yeah, if you
that's
want a
amazing,
stretch goal, exactly. Like
Mm.
keep growing,
Mhm.
absolutely. And then same with criticism. Let's meet next week before the meeting with the CEO. Let's go through the deck and any questions. So this idea of context, observation, result, next steps, but it forces us to really get clear on what I want to say to this person. And I like to, we were talking on our podcast of how we like to actually just write these, sort of bullet points out before we have these conversations. First, to hold ourselves accountable to actually doing it. But it forces you to get really clear, because we'll do this in workshops where people will practice giving this feedback. And all of a sudden, there's this other person there. And even though it's a role play, all of a sudden people start rambling. And it's like, well, Sean, thanks so much for coming. Oh,
Yeah.
it's just great to see. How are you? And we just start like we
Yeah.
totally ramble,
Yeah.
and without the practice, so you can work through the nervousness and any emotion, and some real emotion can come up. So it's helpful to practice several times so that by the time you're having the conversation, you are clear on what it is you want to say. And
Mm.
you're also clear, like, I really like to go into this. What is my intention with this person? My intention is to be helpful. Because sometimes I might be going to this conversation and I'm just really pissed off. Like, is my intention to be helpful, or is my intention to say, why did you do it this way? Or this was a disaster,
Yeah.
And so I think
And
really going
and
back to what
also
you said about curiosity, like,
you may think that you know why it happened, what happened, etc. But actually, they're going to have a completely different perspective to you. So if you walk in there making that assumption, your intention is like, well, I'm going to tell them how it is because I know exactly what happened there. I know what's going on. I'm trying to like lead them through a conversation. So they basically go, yes, that's exactly what happened.
I-
You might be, it kind of it's the wrong
you're like
setup, right? Like,
leading the witness in the court of law. Like, yes,
totally.
John, on February 10th. Yeah,
That's
no,
right.
exactly. And we do this all the time. I did this. I recently, I've never been in an organization where I just so much trust and care. And Jason is my manager, um and so I had gotten an email and I was surprised that I wasn't involved in this project. And it all seemed so obvious to me. So I said, hey, Jason, do you have a minute to talk? And he said yes. And so I explained, and I was expecting him to be like, "Oh, of course, that was such a strange oversight. Why didn't I do that?" But that wasn't what he said at all. He's like, "I don't see it that way at all. I see it this way, blah blah." And I was like, and then he's like, "And I'm kind of frustrated." And I said, "Oh," I said, "Well, I wasn't expecting that at all, and I'm kind of frustrated." And we have the language to talk about it with each other,
Yeah.
and I was like, "This is really bizarre. I wasn't." So it's just such a good
Mm,
reminder. We go into the like our minds are such amazing story making machines, and so it didn't even occur to me,
mm,
that Jason might have had a different perspective on the situation. So it's always,
yeah.
I teach this to force myself to practice it.
So when and I like that when I think that one of the places to your point, like I say, there's the rambling and setting up the context to start with, and the person on the other side of that conversation is going, where is this going? Like, just
Right?
get to
They're
the
just
point,
like,
for
just
God's
tell
sake.
me,
Just
like just
please, just get to the point. So you get
yeah.
to context, you're like, okay, this was the context, and then the observation. To your point, the desire to the inability for people to hold back their judgments in that description of actually what happened is, I find, it's a really hard habit for people to break. Um, and so
Yes.
I always try to like think about it like facts. Like, you just think about it like a bank robbery. Okay, there's a bank robbery. There's 9 people in the bank. And every one of those people, of course, has a completely different description of the height, the color of the skin, the tone of voice, what was said, where they moved to. Everyone's got a different map. So the map is not the territory. No one has an actual reality, right? None of you have a reality. And therefore, all you can do is describe how you saw it, describe what you thought was happening without and it means this, and it means this, and it means this, to give that person a chance to respond, because because you will get caught out very quickly when you've already gone in with that sort of predetermination. Yeah, I really like that model. Okay, so
Absolutely.
context,
So well
observation,
said.
results, and then next
Result.
steps. That's
Yeah.
good.
And it also forces you to get clear. And this is I think praise is such an underutilized tool for folks of what does good look like, and especially as leaders are trying to scale and grow their organization, when something goes well, how does this align to your company's culture, to your values? Why was this result the result you were looking for? And so because you can't always, replicate the outcome, but you
Mm,
can replicate the inputs and what you were trying to do. And so when you get really specific about why this was good, it's like if somebody says, "Oh, that was a great presentation." Well, tell me what was it that made it great, because that tells me more about you, what you value, and
mm,
what was it that didn't work? Why
yeah.
didn't it work? What would have been more helpful? So that's how we grow, when we learn what's working well specifically. And it also is a sort of window into what other people value.
Do you feel like, I was just, as you were saying that, I had this, sort of thought bubble of the feedback sandwich? Do you remember the feedback sandwich? Like, okay, I'm going
Sure
to deliver you
do.
something hard to hear. So first I'm going to butter you up with something that I think's great. Then I'm going to like slam you with this, like punch in the face. And then I'm going to give you some nice buttery, fluff at the end. You're gonna
Yeah.
love it. Like, you're going to accept that feedback sandwich and eat it wholeheartedly. What happened to that model? I haven't heard it used for a long time.
Uh,
Thank God, because it was a
Yes,
terrible model.
yeah, I think well, I don't know, maybe all of our gluten intolerance, we had to let that go. But but the reason why, from a radical candor perspective, the real problem with the feedback sandwich is that it's not clear.
Hmm,
We're all about clarity. And so it's like, wait, so
yeah.
this was good. Okay, but no, this was bad. Okay, but wait, this is good. So
Hmm,
like tell me what to do. Like,
hmm.
and so that's
Confusing.
why we want this feedback to be frequent. One of the things we also joked about on our podcast was, Jason shared how, one of his first jobs, this might go back to sort of the same management book that had the feedback sandwich, was like the boss saying, let's go walk for a cup of coffee. Now, I don't know if this translates where you are, if there's a different beverage, but, it was like he said he lost his taste for coffee because every time you knew that walk for the cup of coffee was not going to
You
end well. This was like criticism, like you're walking the plank to get the criticism. And so I think it's the reason why we want to have more praise than criticism, and we want these things to be frequent, is because we want to point out like what's work. And it doesn't have to be these huge things. It just little moments. Like even if I say in this conversation, "Oh, you bringing up the feedback sandwich was such a great question," because it helps me go even deeper into why things are or are
mm,
not effective, and so it doesn't need to be sort of this big grand thing. But so first of all, it's not clear, I don't know what to do. And then second of all, we want this to be more frequent so that these things can kind of, I don't think it's terrible to have some praise and then have some criticism, but we want it to
mm,
be frequent enough that we're doing it. Maybe
yeah,
we don't need an
and
exact count, but four
yeah,
or five pieces of praise every so often, and then a piece of criticism, so it's
it
not like a formula. It's
yeah,
just a frequent conversation.
yeah, it brought up an image in my head of your comment before about the sort of accelerator and brake. If you imagine driving in your car, if on a normal trip, you're probably gonna have your foot on the accelerator. 80 to 90% of the time, and 10% of the time you're gonna have to brake, or it's almost like kind of pulling on the handbrake rather than even the foot brake. Like you might go a little bit slower, but actually, if you have it all the way up the handbrake, nothing you do on the accelerator is going to work. And so, if every time you rock up to a conversation with one of your team and they're expecting, oh, here we go again, like I'm about to get,
Yeah.
it's like that's not a good relationship to be in. What do you do, Amy, if I know this happens for a lot of leaders where two colleagues aren't working all that well together? And maybe maybe you haven't quite built, radical candor. Maybe not everybody in the organization has the skills yet for these conversations. You're a bit earlier on, but you see two people that actually kind of really you want them to be able to give each other better feedback, and you feel like this kind of risk of sitting them down like children in a room to go, okay, John, you need to talk to Jane, and Jane, you need to give some feedback to John. And how do you manage that situation? How does sort of radical candor think about that kind of scenario?
Yeah, that I think that's one of the hardest things. And when we talk about sort of encouraging it, building this culture of radical candor where you as the manager, you're soliciting it, you're giving it, and one of the things we didn't talk about was gauging it, which is this idea that radical candor is measured not for my mouth as the speaker, but for you as the listener. So like how did it land for you?
Mm,
And then so we talk about get it, give it, gauge it, how is it landing? There's no sort of one objective measure. That's why we want this in person if we can, or at least with video or, in synchronous time. And then encouraging it. And the way that you start to encourage it is for, first of all, for you as the leader to be soliciting it. And when it comes to your team, not only are you modeling this and, in your larger meetings, you're sort of reflecting when you've gotten some criticism and how you're acting on, you're acknowledging things specifically. But I think the example that you're talking about is, one person comes to you and, it's like Adam complaining about Ben, and then, Ben comes to you complaining about Adam. And, so even though I think the most important skill of all of this is listening, we spend a lot of time actually practicing listening because there's no better way, I think, to show that you care, to really understand what that person, what matters to them, the sort of context. But this is the one time I'm going to encourage you not to listen, because after you've heard it the first time, you're like, oh yeah, Ben is such a challenge, and then you talk to Ben, oh yeah, Adam is such a train wreck, or no, that's what we call manipulative insincerity. This is where we talk about people and not to people. And there's a great quote, you might know it from the head of Pixar. He says, if there's more truth happening in the hallways than in the meetings, we have a problem. And that's really the behavior that you're talking about that we're trying to really nip in the bud. And that's your job as the manager. We do want, Adam and Ben or whoever these two people are to talk to each other. And if they're not having success with that, then you would need both of them to talk to you, because you're only getting, to your point, like maybe Ben sees a scorpion and Adam sees a lizard, and it's like, okay, like what are the qualities of the lizard? What are the quality, like you might
mm.
need to mediate. If for some reason it's someone that actually you don't report to, then have that person's manager. So it's like all four of you are in the room. I do think that can be some of the hardest work, but if you
Mm.
have been modeling that you value this and you're encouraging people to do it, like that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to take away a culture where people are coming to you and saying, well, I heard this thing. And, it's sort of all of these like side games of telephone. And you want people to be talking as much as we can to each other.
That's so true. I remember somebody saying to me, "Don't don't turn your boss what was it like? Don't turn your boss into." I guess it was basically like, don't make your boss the mediator of you guys. Like, you guys need to have this conversation together in a way that builds relationship, because every interaction is either probably building the relationship or diminishing the relationship in some way based on the quality of that interaction. And the adjudicator, she's like, don't ever turn your boss into the adjudicator.
Yeah.
That should not be your
Yeah,
boss's
and
role.
I mean, sometimes if
If it's
it gets to
required,
that point, then
sure, yeah.
both of you
You
go.
can't work your way
But we
through it.
really want people to feel empowered that,
Yeah.
you can have these relationships, and that same order of operations, you talked about peer-to-peer feedback. And I will say, I think this can be very challenging for people because sometimes you feel like it's sort of like the what's in it for me.
Mm,
Well, all I see is a whole lot of, I'm so busy, I'm so stressed, like am I really going to go out on a ledge for this person, et cetera? And so I think that's where having these values of like, we we've got each other's backs. We had a partnership with Second City Works, the improvisation group here in the U.S. And back when we were doing more in-person stuff, we would do a show with improvisers. So they're really funny. So I just met this guy once, and he came out from the bathroom. We were just about to go on stage, and his fly was down. And I'm looking around like, okay, well, who's going to tell him that his fly is down? We're just about to go on stage, and I was like, okay, Amy. First of all, you're teaching Radical Candor, so you. And second of all, like you, it's just literally you and him is the way to on stage. Like you are between him and that audience. And
Mm,
so I pulled him to the side and I told him, and of course he was an improviser, so he was very funny and very really appreciated it. But the reason why I share that story, first of all, like it's all of our tendency to be afraid or, to not want
mm,
to do this. But also, there's a phrase in improv. If you're going to go on stage live, it's got your back. And that idea of like, you're not going to let me go on stage with my fly down, and I'm not going to let you go on stage with your fly down. And it
mm,
goes back to what you were talking about of like building this culture that if I was making a mistake this whole time, that I would trust that somebody's going to tell me I'm messing up. And if all of a sudden I find out I've been doing this thing for a year and nobody had the courage to tell me,
mhm.
those are like, and so
You
that's
feel
the
very
kind of
let down.
culture that
Yeah.
we're trying to,
Mm,
yeah, I mean, that when you think about sort of trust and safety. And so I would encourage for anyone in an ideal world, things are trickling down that bosses are soliciting feedback, but peer to peer, sometimes you have to be the one to make that offering, to solicit feedback. Maybe you're doing something that's getting in the way of them getting the
mm,
deliverables to you on
mhm.
time. Maybe you're, giving them last minute that you don't know. Like, what's one thing I could do to help make our partnership more effective?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. When you were sharing your story about, that operations person who shared that feedback, it reminded me of some difficult peer-to-peer relationships I had, and I never sort of reached out proactively to say, "Hey, how could I be a better working partner for you?" Or, "This is really important. What's one way I could make things a bit easier for you?" So if we
Mm,
can start to model that with each other, it can go a long way. And just to acknowledge, peer-to-peer, I think sometimes can actually be almost the hardest one because it's a
yeah.
little bit like, "What's the ROI in this?"
Mm.
It's easier for me to just go complain to my boss.
And I think if as a leader, when you're thinking about the building of your culture, if you can crack that nut, like if you can truly build a culture where actually your team feel like each other has each other's back and that they feel like you as their
Hmm.
leader have their back, that's a relationship where people are actually going to feel free to take risks. People feel free to make, mistakes. They know they're not going to get caned for it. Like that's when your business really starts to thrive because everyone's not running around waiting to be caught out for something or like shamed in some way because the only feedback that happens is basically people get hung out to dry or only get given negative feedback or it's public or whatever, which is really, super toxic. And I imagine, I've worked on values with, done lots of values workshops in building new businesses or brands or, acquiring a subsidiary and things like that. And all working with private clients. And when we get almost without fail, somebody comes up with honesty as a value, usually honesty and integrity are always somewhere in the top five. And I'm like if we have to call out integrity as one of our big values, that it's kind of scary. But honesty is, I think, this kind of shift, and so it might help people who are looking at their values, going, "Well, I've already got honesty as my value." I'm like, well, honesty is kind of pretty close to truth. Like maybe radical candor would be, and like I've got your back would be a really nice coupling of some values to go, hey, we actually give really high quality, we give really good guidance to each other, but we do it in a way that's comes from a place of care and support and knowing that we're actually going to keep each other safe. Like that's a nice place to operate in. That's a culture you'd want to be part of.
I really appreciate that framing. And what's coming to mind is, another phrase that we use, if you or you tend to have this struggle with obnoxious aggression where the challenge is really clear, but you're not caring so much. We also will call it compassionate candor. And because we would see that a lot where it's like, oh, I'm just being brutally honest. It's like, no, that's not brutal honesty. That's still obnoxious aggression. Going back to what you were saying, I'm just telling you how it is. So
Mhm.
I think when we talk about words like honest or truth, I think, you know, keep like double clicking on those. What's one specific example? What does that actually mean? That's why we like to have people tell their stories. What does care personally and challenge directly look like for you? Because to your point, those words can sort of seem kind of big and amorphous. And It's like, how does it actually show up for you? Give me an example of these behaviors that are associated with these different values. And I think it's very tempting for leaders to, oh, my team needs to work on this, right? We need to, and but it's like, I hate to say it, but you've got to be the one that
You
really
got to start.
models that behavior,
Yeah.
and that when somebody gives you some radically candid feedback, that you explore it, you talk about it. And when you can model that and share that back with your team, like, hey, I understand I've been making this mistake, I'm so grateful for it being called out for me, like, this is what I'm going to do. That's how you start to build that
Mm,
safety. But you are really the one.
got to
People
start
are
with
going
you.
to believe far more about what your behavior is rather than maybe a few words on a website.
Oh, Amy, I could talk to you about this all day, but unfortunately, we don't have all
Yeah.
day, and we are probably at the end of our time before people end up spending 2 hours listening to our podcast. But I just want
Okay.
to say a huge thank you from me. That's been such a joyful conversation, and really valuable. I think it's such a under discussed part of it's like it's so embedded in all of our work practices. We spend so much time doing this, but actually often very unconsciously with no thought, no depth, and no training and kind of how to do it better and understanding the implications of doing it well or not doing it well. So thank you very much for sharing that with the audience. I'm sure they'll find it super valuable. You have a download, I believe, that people can get access to that will help them give a little bit of. Do you have a web link or something that people can follow? How would you suggest that people, learn more about Radical
We do.
Candor and
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can go to our website, radicalcandor.com. And then we do have, if you want to download some tips, we've got a lot of tips available. People love the specificity of the tools and the practices to start to put it into action. So that's radicalcandor.com/one ONE hyphen. So just that little
Mhm.
dash pager, PAGER. So
Okay,
radicalcandor.com/one
one hyphen
pager. Maybe
pager?
you can
Yeah,
put that in
show
the show
notes.
notes as well. But yeah, I love the conversation, and I am really passionate about it because people want to succeed at work. Like, we all want to do our best, we all want to do well, and I think especially now, if we can build these kinds of relationships, not only to do great work, but to actually feel like, wow, I made a difference for someone today. It's inspiring. It's inspiring to be able to spend this time with you. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. Folks, I hope you really enjoyed the show today. Huge thanks to Amy Sandler from Radical Candor. Before you go, if you know the best thing that you could do for us is just to share that, just tell one person about Scale Up's podcast and this episode specifically, something that you liked about it. Feel free to go on the socials and let us know what you liked. We're at Scale Up's podcast, or you can email us at questions@scaleupspodcast.com. You've been listening to Scale Up's podcast. I am Sean Steele, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you.
G'day everyone, just a couple of quick things before you go. If you have questions that you'd love myself or an upcoming guest to tackle about challenges that you're facing in scaling your business, please just jump straight on the website, scaleupspodcast.com. You can record your message straight from your mobile by hitting the button on the right-hand side of the page, or you can just email them the old-fashioned way, questions@scaleupspodcast.com. And just a quick reminder, nothing we spoke about today constitutes financial or business advice. If you are considering making big decisions in your business, seek out a professional who can look at your situation in detail and make sure you're getting sound, personalised advice. Thanks for listening. Look forward to being back in your podcast feed next week.